What's the scariest 100% true story you've heard of? Story 1. One of my friend's family growing up had a beach house and I'd get invited every now and then. They had dollars and the house was massive. Pretty cool place too. They even had a full-time maid who had her own flat at the back. One day they go there for a long weekend and when they opened the door, the place had been ransacked. It was all a mess. Missing TVs, furniture, broken stuff. You get the picture. They went to check on the maid, and her flat was empty. All her belongings were gone. They called the cops who came over and had a brief look, not interested from what they said, and left saying the maid probably had something to do with. And that's what everyone believed for a week, until the dad returned the following weekend to try and change the locks and etc., and he brought their dogs along with him. Yep, you know it. One of the dogs started digging and found the maid buried in the backyard under a tarp they had close to the pool. So the theory now is that whoever came in probably knew her, and she recognized them, and she had to go edit. I added the gruesome details on a post below. I don't recommend reading them, but it's there for those who are curious. Story 2. My high school GF called late one night after I was home and in bed. She said that something had happened and asked if I could come over. She was clearly shaken and not full of details. So I told my parents and drove over towards her house. At the top of her subdivision, I was met by a cop with lights on. He asked where I was going and I told him about the call from my GF. He lets me go by and I come over the hill to the cul-de-sac where she lives and I see multiple cop cars around the circle. They watch me pull up and get out of my car. My GF comes running out of her house and meets me in the street. She explains that someone had broken into her neighbor's house and started beating her with something heavy. The neighbor managed to get out of the house and headed to my GF's house where she started banging furiously on the front door. My GF's dad was out of town, so her mom answered the door and the neighbor just fell into the foyer, bleeding profusely from the head. Her mom looks up to see the attacker headed up the walkway towards the front door. She pulls the neighbor into the house and closes the door, hitting the attacker with it before it fully closed. He then took the heavy tool he had used to beat the neighbor and smashed the little window at the top of the door. Her mom started screaming and the attacker just turned around and walked up the street into the darkness. I spent the night there that night, along with 2 or 3 cops outside in their cars, and in the morning we could see blood still pooled on the floor in the foyer and splattered blood above the front door from where the attacker had swung the tool to smash the window. No one was ever caught or even identified. It was just completely random. The neighbor survived and to my knowledge had no permanent physical injuries beyond scarring from having her scalp stapled shut. She moved away shortly after the incident. Edit. Update on victim status and paragraphing, though probably not correctly. TLDR. GF's neighbor was brutally attacked in her home. She ran to my GF's house and the attacker fled after nearly getting into their house too. No one was ever caught. Story 3. My aunt fell asleep on her couch one night and my uncle was asleep upstairs. She woke up around 12 a.m. to a random man staring at her while she slept. He said, the guy upstairs was sound asleep, meaning he came in, saw my aunt on the couch, looked around, saw my uncle asleep upstairs, and then sat there and watched. She told him to leave and somehow by the will of God he left. He slid in through the back door. We live in a relatively safe area. Craziest I have ever heard. Story 4. I work midnight shift at a gas station and I have for quite a while at various stations in different areas with varying levels of criminal activity. I have regulars, of course. I'm a small-statured woman, as is my partner the other half of the week, and we've always been partners. So these regulars often worry about us and keep watch on creepy occurrences when they can. I had one man who worked in the metro an hour away who would stop in every morning for his cigarettes. He never smiled or seemed friendly, and as I often do, I tried to think of what I could do that might make him smile one day. It took many months, but I finally pulled it off by having his cigarettes ready on the counter and already scanned for him to pay for as he walked in. He smiled, and then asked me, "Do you ever get scared on the night shift? You small girl is not safe." I said I sometimes did, but we could lock the doors and hide if we had to, and that the provincial police, think state troopers if you're American, had a station close by and came in often to get their highway vehicles washed. I had a good rapport with those police. He nodded and then told me a story about when he first moved to our country from Eastern Europe with his wife and child back in the late 80s, early 90s. He fell asleep at work one night at the gas station he worked midnights at. When he woke up, the phone had been ringing for hours and his manager was shaking him violently asking if he was all right. He was fine, he said. What was the problem? He was sorry he fell asleep. His manager screamed that it was fine he fell asleep, to look outside. All of their motor oil was missing and the outside of the place was a mess. The thieves had come and swiped all the oil and left him be because he slept through the entire thing, and then moved down the road to the next station for an encore. At that station, the clerk was awake and fought back, so the thieves stabbed him to death and left him to bleed out. When he finished telling me this, he concluded with, "If you ever feel sleepy, just lock the door and do it. It might save your life." I don't work at that station anymore, but I think about that guy all the time and wonder how his grandkids are. Here is a link to an article talking about how that poor other clerk's killers were finally found 25 years later. Story 5. When I was learning to drive, my instructor advised me to always lock my car doors as soon as I get into my car. I asked her why, and she told me her personal experience. This happened almost a year after she passed her test. She finished work about 3 a.m. She just gotten into her car and gotten her keys in the ignition when 3 guys jumped into her car. She had a knife to her neck and was told to drive. They give her directions to an alleyway. They dragged her out of the car and raped her. After they were done with her, they left her in the alleyway and stole her car and purse. It took her a while to get help. Police did find her car a few days later, abandoned and on fire, on the outskirts of the city. But the guys were not caught. The reason she started to teach driving was her way to protect other women and make sure no one else goes through what she went through. So she advised all her female students to lock their car doors as soon as they get in. Edit to add. Wow, I wasn't expecting this comment to go this big. I'm still in contact with my instructor via social media. I sent her screenshots of this comment and the other comments. She is happy that her advice such a warning is out there before she retires for health reasons. She wants me clear a misunderstanding that she saw in the comments. She does give the same advice to her male students, and she does tell them her experience, but leave out the rape part. She does get messages from her past students, including me, saying, "Thank you for the advice, warning," and we tell her about our close calls. A message of her, "Thank you for sharing your experience and advice, so that others can be safe and they don't go through the same experience." Story 6. I was around 10 years old. I was at school, but my mom told me she was thinking of taking me to the doctor's in the afternoon. Recurring eye issue. Lunchtime, and I'm in the dining hall when the office woman told me there was a taxi outside for me and I needed to go. I assumed my mom booked it for me as she can't drive. I cleared up my stuff and got my bag. Just about to leave when I remembered my jacket in my classroom. I rushed to get and head out for the taxi. Office woman tells me I'm too late and the taxi had gone without me. I just went back to class, but panicking my mom would be angry at me. School finishes and my mom is waiting for me at the gates. I burst into tears apologizing for missing the taxi and thinking I was in big trouble. She never ordered a taxi and had no clue what I was talking about. She ended up not making the doctor appointment. No one ever found out who ordered the taxi or who driver was. My mom doesn't like to think what would have happened if I hadn't forgotten my jacket and got in that taxi. TLDR missed a taxi I thought my mom booked for me, only to find out it could have been an attempted kidnapping. Story 7. Well, it's my story. When I was a little kid, 5, 6, we had this neighbor like grandma to me. I'd go over and have snacks, and she had a Mr. Potato Head I played with that was her, now adult son's toy. Weird core memories. He came home in his 20s, from the army, I think. I don't remember much about him, but he asked about taking my older brothers camping. But my mom said no. She had a weird feeling about him. Side note, we lived out in the country, not even a town, just a place. There were no locked doors. Everyone trusted each other. My mom saw him at our little store with bee stings all over and was concerned. He said he got them at the creek. She thought that was weird, because that's just not a thing where we went all the time, but okay? A little while later, not sure how long, the news said there was a murder of some campers out past where we lived. No leads. People were shocked. This doesn't happen here. My mom remembered her weird feeling and the bee stings that didn't make sense. She called the police to say, "Hey, probably nothing, but here's what I got." I remember detectives coming to our house to talk to her. They had some other evidence that matched, but not enough to link him to the murder, a couple with their child. It's unsolved to this day, though the detective said he knew it was him. A few years later, the guy went to prison for an abduction, attempted murder of a woman who ran out of gas and he offered her a ride. She lived, thank God. Story 8. When I was a freshman in high school, I saw two men get in a fight, and one man put a gun in the other man's mouth and told him to beg for his life, which he did. 14-year-old me peed his pants multiple times after that and needed counseling. Story 9, World War II, the Pacific Theater. My great uncle on my mother's side fought at Okinawa. While taking cover behind a rock, he was shot through the foot by a Japanese sniper and evacuated to a hospital for recovery. He was the only member of his platoon to make it off the island alive. Story 10. My uncle was in a bar one night and started talking to this random guy. He described him as a really nice guy. He met him a few other times in the same bar. They drank and talked about random stuff. Soon after, my uncle stopped seeing the guy at the bar. IDK how long after, but my uncle got notified that he had jury duty. He showed up and found out what it was for. A serial killer, and the killer was his friend from the bar, Derek Todd Lee. My uncle was promptly dismissed from jury duty for obvious reasons. Story 11. My grandfather's village was razed by the Nazis. He had 9 siblings. The Nazis came to the village in retribution due to guerrilla attacks, and they believed the guerrillas were hiding there. Most young men fled before they arrived. The men that were in the village were lined up against a wall and shot. My grandfather's mother put half her children, the youngest, in the cellar, and she took the other half with her because the Nazis were rounding up the entire village and locked them inside the church. The reason she had split her children was because she feared they would all be killed, so she wanted at least some of them to survive. The Nazis ransacked and burned nearly every house in the village, including my grandfather's. He was in the cellar with his siblings and their house burned above them, but they were saved. Those in the church also survived, but many didn't. After this, the Nazis would come again sometime after and pretty much force all the young men and boys, including my grandfather, to help make roads and fortifications for them. Despite it all, they all survived the war, though many in the family didn't. Story 12. So when I was around 18, I went to town to drink something with my friends. We went all in, and by 2 a.m., I was completely wasted. Couldn't see, walk, or think straight. One of my mates remained sober to drive us back home. We went to the parking lot, and I could hear a voice whimpering somewhere in the dark. I turned around and saw 2 guys carrying a girl to a car. I got closer, and now I could hear her voice. She obviously was drunk, but she repeated, "No," and "I don't want," over and over. Adrenaline kicked in, and I became sober instantly. I screamed at them and immediately called the police. I wasn't fast enough so they could get in the car and drive off. But I saw the license plate, gave it to the woman I talked to at the police station, and they informed me about 10 minutes later that they arrested the 2 guys. The whole scene was so terrifying. This was in Germany. Edit. Thanks for all the nice comments and upvotes. If you need help dealing with sexual violence or need someone to talk, USA 988. I think Germany 0800 16E16. Story 13. My college girlfriend called me one night. The Baton Rouge serial killer had been active a while, and she was being followed, all over town and even after going in circles, by a wild truck, which the killer supposedly drove. She fit the victim profile. She was brunette living in, house sitting for her aunt, a wealthy neighborhood. My roommate and I drove over and we filed in line behind her in the truck. She lived essentially on the LSU grounds, so I assumed it was a stupid student prank or something. She parks at her aunt's house, truck stops 1 house short of her aunt's, and we pull in behind her. I explain I'm going to go defuse the situation. Walk over to the truck. The FBI says the killer is a white guy. This man is African American. Explain no one is upset, but he's freaking out my girlfriend. He needs to leave. He looks side-eyed at me and drives off. I see the guy again a few months later. On the cover of the Baton Rouge paper, he's been arrested. He was the killer. Story 14. A chimpanzee named Travis attacking his owner's friend. Travis attacked and mauled his owner's friend, blinding her, severing several body parts, and lacerating her face before he was shot and killed by a cop. The owner called 911 during the attack. Travis's screams can be heard in the background at the start of the tape as the owner pleads for the police. Initially, they believed the call to be a hoax until she said, "He's eating her." Story 15. In the 1990s, a nurse in New Jersey killed hundreds of hospital patients. Sometimes he would sneak into patients' rooms at night and inject them with fatal medication doses. Other times, he would put the medication into IV bags in the supply room, so they would kill whatever random patient they were given to later. He was accused several times. Some patients pointed him out before they died. Some staff thought he was creepy and dangerous and refused to work with him. He kept getting fired from hospitals. But the hospital managers knew that if he got arrested, they would be sued by the families of the patients he murdered. So they just fired him and didn't call the police. That happened at 12 different hospitals over the course of 16 years. Investigators believe he killed as many as 400 people. After he was arrested, he confessed to 40 murders. In 29 of them, he gave enough detail to be charged and plead guilty. He is linked to 300 plus more deaths than that. But details of those will probably never be known, because so much information was lost over time or destroyed by the hospitals. Story 16. The Case of the Clutter Family Murders, told expertly by Truman Capote in his book, In Cold Blood. What really gets me about the case is that all it took was one person knowing the family to make the connection that ultimately ended their lives. Floyd Wells, a former employee of the father, told his cellmate about the Clutters, and that inmate, Richard Hickok, became convinced the family had a fortune stored in a safe at their house. Upon his release, Hickok contacted another former cellmate, Perry Smith, and they planned to rob the family. There was no safe and no fortune. Instead, the pair left with a small radio, a pair of binoculars, and less than $50 cash, along with the lives of Herb, Bonnie, Kenyon, and Nancy Clutter. A quote from Hickok talking about Herb has especially stuck with me. "I thought he was a very nice gentleman. I thought so right up to the moment I cut his throat." Story 17. This only happened earlier this year. A work colleague was off work for a long time, not like him at all. When he eventually returned, we found out that his friend had been murdered by a group of football soccer wankers. They'd been in a pub watching a match for the team they supported. They were celebrating a win when a group of men from the opposing team got angry and started arguing. When my colleague and his friends left the pub, they jumped his friend and beat him so bad he ended up in hospital, where he eventually succumbed to the injuries. This is one of the reasons I hate football, especially where I am, England. Riot vans, hundreds of police, etc., always around every train station and football stadium. Sad little men willing to take a life over a bag of air getting kicked around. It's not the first time, certainly won't be the last. Someone has died over fucking football. Story 18. Up to this day, I'm still looking for a logical explanation to this. This happened in 2003, so I and an ex were checked in a coastal resort where the cottages were far apart, like 200 meters away. Around 11:30 p.m., while we're both drinking beer with the lights turned off and only the TV on, the door suddenly rattled violently, like someone was forcibly trying to get it open. There was no double lock on the door, so my first reaction was to jump from the bed and block the door with my weight. The force of my landing must have been heard from the other side, but the twisting of the doorknob continued. By this time, I was already pressing my face to the floor, trying to estimate how many people were outside the door via the small gap between the floor and the bottom of the door. There was nothing, not one pair of feet or anything, but the door just kept rattling. I should point out that the gap between the floor and the door was enough for me to see the outside, or at the very least notice any change in shadow light caused by movement. But there was nothing. The turning of the door then stopped, but I never heard any footsteps or any other noise. Waited a few minutes and opened the door. Everything was quiet. No footprints outside or on the sand surrounding the cottage. We just noped out of there immediately. Story 19. The Murder of Sylvia Likens. It's equal parts heartbreaking and scary, due to the fact that humans can be so cruel. Story 20. When I was 17, I was hanging out with two friends, and they wanted to go smoke weed in the woods. I didn't feel like it, so I drove them and waited in the car. After a while, I was getting bored and decided to go meet them, but there were 4 paths going off in different directions, so I just took the biggest one. After walking for a few minutes in the pitch-black forest, before flashlights on phones, I come across this dip in the trail, and on the other side is a bench lightly visible due to the moonlight. On the bench is sitting a man and another one is standing in front of him, but I can only make out silhouettes. Being sure these are my friends, I yell out to them before walking over. If you ever walk the woods at night, it's just an uneasy feeling all around, so I was cautious to begin with. Well, it turns out, just after yelling out to my friends, both silhouettes turn around towards me. Not a word, not a sound. The guy sitting down starts sprinting full fucking speed towards me in complete silence. I got the absolute out of there, sprinting also the other way and tripping over because I couldn't see anything. I finally get out and lock myself in my car, but I was really worried for my friends. Maybe a minute later, I see them both coming out of a completely different path. They also confirmed they never saw me or anyone else. My heart still sinks. Just thinking about that dude sprinting in silence UTF was that. Story 21. My grandfather was a British FIPO in Japan in WW2. He did something to off the guards of his camp one evening, and they beat him badly and tied him up on a fence with the promise to kill him the next day. Another young prisoner died during the night, so they switched my granddad and the dead lad, so the guards assumed he'd died from his injuries. Luckily, he survived and came home in 1945. Story 22. The Legend of Bearman. So people think of that one South Park episode with Bearman Pig. No, it's not even close to that. So there was this camp I used to go to during the summer. There was probably around 500 kids there for a week straight. Everyone had cabins they would stay in assigned by gender and age, and had an older person be in charge of one cabin. The older person was around 17, 18, watching 13, 16-year-olds in the cabins. And then the staff were actual adults who had their own cabins, but they would be on night shift duties to walk around and make sure everyone was staying in their cabins. So now that you kind of know the setting, let's get into the legend. As it goes, in the woods, and when all the kids were in the cabins and the lights were out, a bear would come out from the deep woods and wander into the campgrounds. The bear would then stand on its back legs and walk as if it was a human. Then it would choose to go into a cabin, and if you were unlucky, it would go by your bed and watch you sleep. If you made any single move, it would grab you and take you into the woods, never to be seen again. Hearing that scared the out of 14-year-old me. It was something the older girl told all of us. A bunch of the other girls were like, "Pff, it's so we stay quiet and sleep." But other kids from cabins heard of it too. I never stopped thinking about it, and I would always try to stay as still as possible when I slept. Flash forward a few years later, I ran into one of the staff that used to work at the camp, and I told them about how scared I was about bearmen. But it was a good trick to use to get kids to stay quiet. Well, turns out it's actually based off a true story. I guess back in the 80s, a man dressed in a bear costume, which was some sort of mascot for the camp at the time, and take girls out of their cabin. So, as you could imagine to my horror, I was completely bewildered that bearmen actually existed at some point in time. Story 23. A robbery at my place, but the way in which it happened. I lived in a basement suite with my younger brother of a quiet neighborhood. The entire front of the house is exposed to the sidewalk, but the sides and the back are covered with fenced and trees. The only way to see if anyone is in the basement is through this small window in my bedroom that's about 5 feet from my bed. I got word while I was out that my place had been robbed. The robbers went through the basement suite door through the back, kicked it open, then made themselves upstairs after robbing the basement suite. They just so happened to rob the place in a 30-minute window when myself, my brother, and the people upstairs were out. This means they were watching us for a couple days and monitoring our patterns. What scared me was not really the robbery, but the image of me sleeping while a robber presses his face against the window, 5 feet from away from my bed just watching me. Story 24. Sad, true, and societally scary. While I was on life support, there was this other girl on a ventilator just down the hall. Like me, she'd had all of the right symptoms. Headaches upon waking, vomiting without nausea, and getting lost in the house where she'd lived for years. Like me, she researched them extensively. Unlike me, she reached the right conclusion and asked her parents for a scan. But they had a bunch of other kids, and money was tight, and she was at the right age to see symptoms as unduly catastrophic. So they said no. Meanwhile, I was treating my symptoms with the gym. My mother had begged me to get a scan, and I'd said no. Until I had health insurance of my own, I couldn't afford it, as it would show a pre-existing condition that would destroy my future insurability. The other patient took up 3 jobs to save the money for a scan. She made the rounds of several neurologists, begging. Each responded dismissively. She was too young and looked so well that she had to be a hypochondriac. Finally, one took pity on her and gave her a scan, telling her outright that it was only so that she'd stop asking and that she'd hear results in some weeks. I kept going to the gym until the day that I collapsed, vomiting blood, bursting a pupil. She went in for her first craniotomy, walking, talking, fine. My parents and boyfriend would sit beside me through my coma, holding my hand, telling me how much they loved me. She'd have her own such trio doing the same. I'd wake. I'd meet her parents, her boyfriend. I'd visit the ICU. I'd see them growing more gaunt, more desperate each time, until the trip when I learned that she'd gone to long-term coma care. I'd recover. She'd die. Brain cancer is that kind of a... Since then, I've taken the survivor's guilt to do everything that I can with my life, but that so easily should've, been her outcome instead. That's the outcome for so many. It's terrifying because it demonstrates how we, as a society, often dismiss the health complaints of all but a narrow slice of the population, without even registering that we're doing it. How many lives do we, unthinkingly, throw away? Story 25. I'm the firstborn, and when I was just a wee babe, my mother put me to bed and headed off to bed herself. Being new parents, they were all about the baby monitor. Dad was already asleep, and just as my mom was drifting off, she heard the telltale crackle. "Don't worry, sweetheart, Mommy's here." Needless to say, my mom about herself and catapulted to the nursery, to find me fast asleep and totally alone. Turns out the neighbor had just had a baby too, and they were picking up each other's signals. They actually picked up all kinds of things over time. Used to hear the truckers radioing to each other from the highway like a mile away. Story 26. My mom is from El Salvador. She lived there at the height of the Civil War. She told me that one time, the terrorist group in her country found out someone in her town was part of the military. He had twin daughters with extremely long hair. They tied their hair to the trailer hitch of their trucks and proceeded to do donuts in the middle of town and drag them until they both died. They then left their bodies on his front door. Story 27. Some guy from Malaysia applied for a job application which needed him to travel to Cambodia. It ended up a scam where he got basically imprisoned and forced into working as a scammer for some crime syndicate, and he somehow escaped, but the syndicate is still out for him and caused irreparable harm to his marriage. It's a fucking horror story and I can't believe it's real. Documentary for those interested. Story 28. My great-grandpa was a combat medic in the Army. He was climbing the cliffs on D-Day at Omaha Beach without a gun, having to stop and remove bullets, bandage wounds, and other things, all while people with machine guns shot down at him. The fact that he got to sit in his favorite leather recliner and tell me that story some 70 years later is a miracle. Story 29. This guy I used to work with, Rowan Baxter. Seemed nice enough, but a friend I worked with, and I used to joke about him being dead behind the eyes, or call him Old Shark Eyes Baxter. This man followed his estranged wife while taking the kids to school. When she stopped at lights, got out and set fire to the car with her and the kids in it. Then killed himself, the fucking coward. Story 30. The other night, my wife took our child out for several hours. In that time, I wrapped up work, then left to get dinner around 4:30 p.m. Got home around 6:30, played with our dog, and did a few chores. Then, when my wife got home about 7:30, we relaxed a bit and I headed for bed about 9 p.m., usually up early with our kid. Maybe 2 minutes after crawling into bed, I get a text from my wife with a picture of our dry erase menu board on our fridge. See, usually at the start of the week, my wife will fill out a rough menu for dinners that week. I remembered seeing it earlier in the day and it was filled out as expected. The picture she sent was of the menu all scrambled up, like the letters were all moved everywhere, with random words and squiggles throughout. Some of it was her writing, but others were incomplete words, or rewritten words in handwriting that wasn't hers or mine. This freaked us out, as our 1-year-old certainly didn't do it. The county sheriff showed up and swept the house and found nothing. Nothing was out of place or missing either. He was spooked by it a bit too. He said they never get a call out in the country where we are and recommended we change our locks. We hadn't, as the couple we bought our home from were elderly. So, we did that night. Edit. See the 2 photos. The one is an example of her writing. The other is the actual scrambled menu with her question she wrote on the bottom and texted to me. Story 31. I would probably say one of the overdoses I've responded to, kid was black. No pulse. Nothing. Hit him with 5 doses of nasal Narcan and chest compressions before he woke up and refused treatment the paramedics on scene. Story 32. Every orphan source report from the IAEA is terrifying and well documented with pictures. One of the most horrifying is the Goiânia accident in 1987. For those who don't know, an orphan source accident is when radioactive material that had been lost, usually from an abandoned hospital, is discovered by people unaware of the danger who inadvertently expose themselves and others to lethal and/or permanently disfiguring doses of radiation. You read in horror, as survivors describe people inviting their neighbors to see the oddity they found and share samples. Children playing with the sparkly dust, all unaware that they have just doomed themselves. Acute radiation exposure is a truly nightmarish way to die. Your flesh rots away over months while skin grafts are ineffective. You deteriorate in pain in the hospital until you die of infection or necrosis. Story 33. My brother was dating the love of his life up until a few years ago. They met because the both worked in a restaurant. He was a piano player, she was a waitress. Things were going amazingly between them. The only problem was, she had a jealous ex. He knew when they left work and what shifts they'd work since it was the same each week. He decided for whatever reason he was going to teach my brother a lesson for dating his ex, and planned to attack him with a Stanley knife when he left work one evening. That night, my brother and his partner were getting ready to leave, and he stopped for a second to talk to a colleague, meaning she left first. As soon as she stepped out the door, he slashed her throat and then ran. She died in front of him. That attack was meant for my brother. He's gone through a lot of therapy, and down some very dark paths since then, but is finally coming out of the other side of it. But it's terrifying how close I came to losing my little brother, and how much he lost as a consequence because of some fucking deranged nutjob. If I could get my hands on that guy, I'd get locked up myself. But he's in prison for a long time, and so far he's staying there. Story 34. I grew up in South Africa circa 90s and 2000s. Don't remember much about the 90s, but I do remember the 2000s. Everyone I knew had been a victim of crime of some sorts. I had 3 cars stolen from my driveway. My parents' house were broken into 28 times in 1 year, a semi-good neighborhood called Sunning Hill in Joburg. My parents were hijacked where my dad ended up with facial surgery. Friends and family have all had some exposure to crime. Ask any expat here in Australia, England, New Zealand, America. All have similar stories. It is because of that I had an imaginary situation that repeated in my head so many times. If I were to be hijacked, what do? I'll my head below the dashboard and floor it. I don't care if I kill the person. I just want to make it out alive. In 2003, it inevitably happened. And I can tell you there are 2 different people on this earth. 1. The guy that went viral for driving a cash-in-transit van or ute and was shot at and managed to escape with defensive driving. Then there's guys like me. I drove from Durban to Umhlanga one evening, and on the highway 4 gunmen appeared. The scenario didn't play out the way it did in my head. I stopped about 50 meters past the hijackers. Not because I wanted to. I was scared shitless to the point where I tried to press the accelerator, but my muscles wouldn't let my foot work. I was paralyzed with fear. They took everything except my life. In 2011, it happened again. But this time, with 10 more years of driving experience and dealing with more crime, I was angry as a Robbie dog. I did not stop. I was driving towards them with red in my eyes, shooting at my car. I got home okay, but jumped on the internet and applied for a visa to Australia. 2 weeks later, my visa was granted, and 2 days later, I was on a plane.